Avant de commencer, j'aimerais vous demander un petit service. J'essaie d'atteindre 1000 abonnés. Une étape très importante pour moi. N'hésitez pas à vous abonner à la chaîne. Un simple clic, mais une grande motivation pour continuer à créer de nouvelles vidéos. Merci beaucoup. The last well in the valley ran dry on the hottest day of summer. And Mrs. Virginia Thorne smiled. She stood on the porch of her ranch house, one hand resting on the whitewashed railing, the other holding a glass of water so clear it caught the light like crystal. Below her, the road that led into town shimmered with heat waves rising from the baked earth, bending the horizon into something that looked like a lake, but was nothing at all. Just air, hot and empty and cruel. She watched the dust rise first. Then the people came with it. Families in wagons, men on horseback, women carrying children on their hips, with their free hands shielding their eyes from the sun. They came from every corner of the Saguarro Valley, from homesteads that had been standing for 2 generations, from farms that had once grown corn and squash and beans along the creek beds that were now nothing but dry white scars in the earth. They came because they had nowhere else to go. The well on the Henderson place had gone first back in April, then the Martinez well in May. The community well near the church lasted until the end of June, producing less and less each week, until one morning the bucket came up with nothing but damp sand. And now the Farley well, the deepest in the valley, the one everyone said would never go dry, had given its last bucket 3 hours ago. That left one well, Virginia Thorne's well, the only water for 20 meters in any direction. The well that had made her the most powerful woman in the territory. She would help them, of course. She always helped them. That was what made the arrangement so elegant. She never turned anyone away. She never raised her voice or made threats. She simply named her price, and her price was whatever they had left to give. Land, livestock, labor, dignity. She accepted all currencies with equal grace. And she had been doing this for 20 years. And every drought made her richer. And every desperate family that came crawling up her road made her more necessary. The saguaro cacti that lined the road to her ranch stood like sentinels, arms raised to a sky that had not offered rain in 14 months. Behind them, the mesa rose red and ancient against the horizon, a wall of stone that split the valley in 2. The mesa had been there before the town, before the Spanish, before anyone. It would be there long after the wells ran dry and the people left and the desert swallowed everything they had built. Virginia Thorne intended to own it all before that happened. In the line of people waiting for water that afternoon, there was a young man named Samuel Fenn. He was about 20 years old, sunburn, and quiet, the kind of man who did his talking with his hands and kept his opinions behind his teeth. He had come not for himself, but for his grandmother, who was sick with a fever and needed water more than medicine. He had walked 4 miles in the midday heat because his horse had died 2 weeks ago, and he could not afford another one. When his turn came, he stood before the foreman that Mrs. Thorne kept at the well, a thick man named Puits, who wrote down names and prices in a leather ledger that had become the most feared book in the valley. 2 head of cattle, Puits said without looking up, for 1 barrel. Samuel had 1 cow. 1 cow left out of a herd that had once numbered 30. He stood there for a long moment, the sun pressing down on the back of his neck, the dust settling on his shoulders. And he did the arithmetic that every man in the valley had learned to do. The arithmetic of survival, where the numbers never added up, and the answer was always the same. Give what you have, or watch someone you love die. He nodded. Puits wrote it down and signaled for a barrel to be filled. Samuel lifted it onto his shoulder, his knees buckling slightly under the weight, and turned to walk the 4 miles home. From the porch, Virginia Thorne called after him, in a voice as sweet as honey poured over glass. "Tell your grandmother I said get well soon." Samuel did not turn around. After the last family had been served, and the last entry had been written in Puits' ledger, another man came up the road. Hole Caraway, president of the Saguarro Valley Bank, the only man in the territory who wore a vest in 110-degree heat. He did not come for water. He came to report. He climbed the porch steps, removed his hat, and stood before Virginia Thorne, the way a general's aide stands before a map. He was not her employee. He was her instrument. The man who turned desperate handshakes into legal documents, who converted the gap between thirst and water into deeds and mortgages and promissory notes that gave Virginia Thorne ownership of things that had once belonged to free people. 3 more families signed today, he said. The Conleys, the Wagner, and old Pete Sullivan. Sullivan gave up his entire South 40. Catherine nodded. She did not smile again. 1 smile per day was enough. The rest was just efficiency. "And the cult debt?" she asked. "Still outstanding. The girl hasn't responded to the notice. She will." 3 miles from Virginia Thorne's ranch, on a rocky hillside that nobody wanted, a 15-year-old girl named May Colton, Clear's throat, stood between 2 graves. The mounds were fresh, the dirt still loose enough that the wind carried it away in small red clouds. Every time the breeze stirred, there were no headstones. May could not afford headstones. She had marked each grave with a cairn of desert rocks, stacking them carefully, the way her father had taught her to stack stones for a fence line. Each one balanced against the others, so the whole thing stood without mortar or cement. Just weight and patience, and the understanding that some things hold together only because someone took the time to make them fit. Her father had gone first. The fever took him on a Tuesday, quietly the way he had lived. He was a man who never raised his voice, who solved problems by thinking about them until the solution presented itself, who believed that the desert would provide for those who respected it. The desert did not provide. The fever burned through him in 4 days, and when it was done, there was nothing left but a body that looked smaller than the man who had lived in it. Her mother lasted 3 days longer. Those 3 days were the worst of May's life. She remembered every hour. She remembered wringing wet cloths for her mother's forehead, cloths that dried almost as fast as she could wet them. Snorts. Because the water was running out. She remembered the moment she realized the bucket was empty, and the barrel was empty, and there was nothing left in the house that could be poured or squeezed or wrung. She remembered running 3 miles in the midday sun barefoot because her shoes had worn through, and she could not afford new ones running down the dirt road toward the Thorne Ranch with her mother's voice fading in her ears. She remembered reaching the gate, gasping, her feet bleeding from the hot gravel, and finding Hulk Caraway standing there with his ledger. "The Colton account is overextended," he said. Not unkindly. He was never unkind. He was simply precise, the way a knife is precise. No further credit can be extended. May dropped to her knees, not as a performance, not as a strategy. She dropped because her legs stopped working, because the weight of what was happening crushed the strength out of her body, because she was 15 years old, and her mother was dying, and the man with the water was telling her that the numbers did not add up. "Please," she said. 1 word, the smallest word in the language. Caraway looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he shook his head. Not because he was cruel, because that was the rule. Rules kept things orderly. Rules kept the ledger balanced. Rules were how civilization worked. Even in the desert. Even when civilization looked like a girl on her knees, begging for water to keep her mother alive. May walked home empty-handed. 3 miles back the way she came. The sun lower now, but no less brutal. Her shadow stretching out before her on the road, like something trying to escape. Her mother died that night. Before she went, she gathered what was left of her strength and took May's hand. Her fingers were dry and light like paper, like something the wind could take. She pulled May close and whispered through cracked lips the words that would determine the course of her daughter's life. "The water is there, sweetheart. Under the mesa. Your grandma knew. Find it." Then she pressed something into May's palm. A small stone smooth flat, about the size of a silver dollar. And it was cold. Not cool the way a stone in the shade is cool. Cold. Unnaturally, impossibly cold. As if it had been sitting in a mountain stream instead of in a dying woman's pocket in the middle of the Arizona desert. "Grandma kept it her whole life," her mother whispered. "From the base of the mesa. Feel how cold it is. That's the water, baby. That's the proof." Then her eyes closed, and they did not open again. May buried her mother next to her father on the hillside and stood between the two hirons and held the cold stone in her fist and tried to understand what she had inherited. 40 acres of rocky hillside that nobody wanted. A crumbling adobe house that leaked when it rained, which was to say, a house that worked perfectly because it never rained. A debt that exceeded the value of everything her parents had ever owned. And a story. The story had come from May's grandmother, Ida Colton, Claire's throat. A woman who had died before May was old enough to remember her face, but whose voice lived on in the stories her mother told. Ida had been a wanderer in her youth, walking the desert the way some people walk through cities, reading the land the way some people read books. She knew things about the Saguarro Valley that the surveyors and the geologists and the mining engineers had never bothered to learn because they looked at the desert and saw emptiness, and Ida looked at the desert and saw a living thing. She had taken May's mother to the base of the mesa when her mother was a child, placed her small hand flat against the rock face, and said words that would pass through 3 generations of women like water through stone. Feel that cool 55 degrees no matter how hot the sun burns above. That's the breath of the water. There is a river under this mesa, a river that has been flowing in the darkness since before anyone can remember. The rock above keeps the sun out, and the earth holds the cold, and the water stays at 55 degrees year-round. Winter and summer drought, and rain. That coolness you feel on this rock face is the water breathing through the stone. Wherever the rock stays cool in summer, the water is close. That's how you find it. You put your hand on the earth, and you feel for the gold, and you follow the cold, and it leads you to the water. Someone just has to be patient enough to dig. Everyone in the valley had heard the story. Everyone had dismissed it. The mesa was solid rock. Every surveyor who had ever looked at it had declared it worthless. Good for nothing but goats and the rattlesnakes that lived in the crevices. The only reliable water in the valley came from Virginia Thorne's well, and Virginia Thorne had made sure it stayed that way. But Ida Colton had believed. She had believed so deeply that she had walked into Whole Caraway's bank 30 years ago, when Caraway was still a young clerk, stamping papers at the back desk, and asked for a loan to dig into the mesa. They turned her down. Of course, they turned her down. An old woman with a crazy story about underground rivers and solid rock. The paperwork probably lasted longer than the meeting. Ida died without reaching the water. She passed the story to her daughter, who passed it to May, who now stood between two graves holding a cold stone and deciding what to believe. She believed the stone. She had to believe something. And the stone was cold. In the middle of summer, in the middle of the desert, the stone was cold. That was not a story. That was not a grandmother's fantasy. That was a fact she could hold in her hand. And facts were all she had left. 1 week after the burial, Whole Caraway came to her door. He wore his vest despite the heat, and carried a leather folder thick with documents. He stood on her porch, removed his hat the way he always did, and laid out the arithmetic of her family's destruction with the patience of a man explaining long division to a child. Her father had mortgaged half the land to Virginia Thorne in the first drought, trading acres for water. Her mother had borrowed from Caraway's bank to cover the remaining debts using the other half of the land as collateral. The interest had compounded, the payments had lapsed during the sickness, and now the total debt exceeded the value of the entire 40 acres. May had 90 days to pay, or the land would be seized and sold. Mrs. Thorne has expressed interest in purchasing the property, Caraway said, as if this were a coincidence, as if Virginia Thorne, expressing interest in distressed land, were something unexpected, rather than the natural conclusion of a system she had designed. She would offer enough for you to relocate somewhere with water. May look at past Caraway to the 2 cairns on the hillside, the loose red dirt still blowing away in the wind. Did Mrs. Thorne send you? Caraway paused. The pause said everything his words would not. I'm here as a banker, Miss Colton, not as anyone's messenger. He closed the leather folder. But if you're smart, you'll take the offer. There's nothing for you here. May looked at the cairns. She looked at the mesa rising behind them, ancient in red, and full of something no one believed in. My mother died because she couldn't get water. May said, I'm not selling anything. Caraway put his hat back on and walked down the porch steps and back toward town. He did not argue. He did not press. He simply left the 90-day clock running because time, like water, always found its way downhill, and he knew where the bottom was. That night, May did not sleep. She sat on the porch with the cold stone in her hand and watched the stars turn overhead, and thought about wells and debts and a grandmother she had never met, who had known something that nobody else believed. She started digging the next morning, not because she had a plan, not because she knew what she was doing. She started digging because the alternative was to sit on the porch and watch the days count down to nothing. And digging at least felt like moving forward, even if she was moving into solid rock. She found the spot by accident, or by something older than accident. A dust storm blew in from the west on her second day alone, the kind of storm that turned the air brown and made breathing feel like chewing sand. She ran for shelter and found it in a natural hollow at the base of the mesa, a shallow depression in the rock that was invisible from the road, hidden by a tumble of boulders and the skeleton of a dead palo verde tree. Inside the hollow, the air was different, cooler, damper. Her skin prickled with goosebumps despite the heat. And when she pressed her palm flat against the rock wall, she felt it. The cold, the same cold as the stone in her pocket. She pulled the stone out and held it against the wall. The same temperature, exactly the same. Her grandmother had stood in this place. She was certain of it. Ida Colton had stood right here, felt the same cold, and known what it meant. And now May stood here 3 generations later, feeling what her grandmother had felt, knowing what her grandmother had known, and clears throat, understanding for the first time that the story was not a fantasy. It was a map. She swung her pickaxe for the first time that afternoon. The sound of metal striking stone rang off the mesa walls and echoed across the empty desert. And nobody heard it, and nobody cared. And May Colton was alone with her grief and her pickaxe, and a cold stone in her pocket, and a debt clock counting down. The only person who noticed was Nettie Groves. Nettie was 60 years old, a widow who lived alone in a small adobe house, half a mile from the Mesa. She had been May's mother's closest friend, one of the few people in the valley who had never laughed at the water story, not because she believed it, but because she had loved the woman who told it. Nettie had survived 20 years in the Saguarro Valley by keeping her head down and her opinions quiet, and her water account with Virginia Thorne in good standing. Survival in this valley meant knowing who had the power and making sure you never gave them a reason to use it against you. She found May at the end of the first week, covered in rock dust, her hands blistered and bleeding, standing at the mouth of a hole that was barely 4 feet deep. Nettie set down what she had brought: dried beans, cornbread, a small jug of water. The kind of provisions one neighbor brings another when words are not enough. She sat on a rock outside the tunnel mouth and waited for May to come out. When May emerged, blinking in the sunlight, her face streaked with dust and dried tears, Nettie looked at her and said, "Your mama would have done the same damn thing." They sat together in the shade of the Mesa and ate cornbread, and Nettie talked about May's mother the way only an old friend can talk about the dead, with love and honesty, in the kind of details that keep a person alive in memory. She told May about her mother as a young woman, fierce and stubborn and unafraid. How she had once stood up to Virginia Thorne in the middle of the market square, right there in front of and everybody, and called her a thief for the price she charged for water. How the whole town had gone quiet. How Thorne had smiled that smile of hers and said nothing. How May's mother had been quietly cut off from credit at the bank the very next week. How no one in the valley had stood up to Virginia Thorne since. She believed that water story more than she believed in God, Nettie said. Maybe she was right. Maybe she was crazy. But she never stopped believing. Nettie paused, and something shifted in her face. The warmth dimmed. Worry crept in at the edges. "I believe in you, child, but be careful. Thorne doesn't like people who don't need her." The warning hung in the air between them like dust that would not settle. Word travels fast in a small valley, even when there is nothing good to carry. Within 2 weeks, everyone in the Saguarro Valley knew about the orphan girl digging into the Mesa. The reactions were not what May expected. She had expected laughter, and there was laughter. She had expected pity, and there was pity. What she had not expected was anger. A group of men came to the Mia on a Thursday morning, led by a rancher named Harlan Briggs, a man whose family had been in the valley for 3 generations, and whose opinion carried the weight of tradition. There were 6 of the men with sun-darkened faces and calloused hands, and the particular stiffness that comes from a lifetime of doing things one way and seeing no reason to change. Briggs did the talking. The Mesa, he explained, sat on the boundary of public land. The road that ran along its base was the only route to Virginia Thorne's well, the only water source left in the valley. If May's digging destabilized the rock, if the Mesa shifted or crumbled, if the road became impassable, then every family in the valley would lose access to the only thing keeping them alive. "We can't risk the well road because of some dead woman's fairy tale," Briggs said. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened man, and frightened men say things they would not say if they had time to think. "Your daddy was a good man," he continued, "but he died broke and foolish. Don't follow him into the ground." The words hit May like a physical blow. She felt them in her chest, in the place where her father's memory lived. She opened her mouth to speak, and then closed it. She looked at Harlan Briggs and at the men standing behind him, and she understood something that would serve her for the rest of her life. That sometimes silence is stronger than any answer. That the people who need to shout are the ones who are afraid, and the people who stay quiet are the ones who know something the shouters do not. She stood in front of her tunnel, small against the mesa, small against the men, small against everything, and she said nothing until they left. They filed away one by one back toward the road, back toward the well, back toward the only life they knew how to live. But one of them lingered, a young man at the back of the group, someone May had not noticed because he had not spoken. He stood for a moment after the others had gone, looking at the tunnel, looking at May, looking at the mesa. Then he walked back toward the road. 20 minutes later, when May went to pick up her tools, she found something sitting on a rock near the tunnel entrance that had not been there before. A coil of rope, good rope, thick and strong, the kind used for hauling. Exactly the kind of thing she needed for dragging broken rock out of the tunnel. She picked up the rope and looked down the road, but the young man was already gone. She did not know his name. She did not know that he had watched her working from a distance, that he had seen her struggling to drag rubble out of the tunnel with her bare hands, that he had gone home and come back with the one thing he could offer without being seen. She would not learn his name for 3 more years. May coiled the rope over her shoulder, picked up her pickaxe with one hand, and reached into her pocket with the other. The stone was still cold. It was always cold. She squeezed it once, then let it go and stepped into the darkness. The sound of metal striking stone echoed off the mesa walls, steady, patient, unceasing. The sound of a girl who had lost everything except a cold stone and a dead woman's promise. And the stubborn belief that somewhere beneath 300 feet of solid rock, a river was waiting. The sun set over the Saguarro Valley, and the stars came out one by one, and the sound continued. It would continue for 3 years. The first collapse came in the 2nd month. May had been sleeping inside the tunnel. Not by choice, not at first, but the walk back to the adobe house took 40 minutes each way, and some nights her body simply refused to make the trip. She would finish a 12-hour stretch of digging, set down the pickaxe, and tell herself she would rest for just a moment before heading home. She would lean against the tunnel wall, close her eyes, and wake up 6 hours later in perfect darkness. Her lantern burned out. Her muscles locked into the shape of the stone she had slept against. She was sleeping like that when the wall gave way. The sound woke her before the impact. A deep groan from somewhere in the rock above a sound she had never heard before. The sound of weight, shifting in ways it was not supposed to shift. Then a crack like a rifle shot. And then the ceiling on the right side of the tunnel dropped. Rock fell in a curtain of dust and noise. A slab the size of a kitchen table landed one hand span from her head. She felt the wind of it on her face, felt the spray of gravel across her arms, felt the ground shake beneath her. Dust filled the tunnel so thick she could not breathe. She pressed her face into the crook of her elbow and crawled toward the entrance, dragging herself over rubble, unable to see, unable to think, operating on nothing but the animal knowledge that forward meant air and backward meant burial. She made it out. She sat in the moonlight with her back against the mesa, coughing dust, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, and she looked at her hands. They were bleeding, torn up by the crawl over broken stone. She turned them over in the pale light and studied the damage the way a carpenter studies a broken tool, not with self-pity, but with the practical question of how long before they could work again. 3 days. She gave herself 3 days, She spent them cutting timber from dead ironwood trees along the wash, dragging the logs to the tunnel, and teaching herself something no one had ever shown her: how to shore up a ceiling. She did it wrong the first time, and the timber shifted under the weight, and she had to pull it out and start again. She did it wrong the second time, using pieces too thin, and they cracked overnight. The third time she chose thicker logs, wedged them at angles she figured out by trial and error testing each one, by hanging her full weight from it before trusting it with her life. The third time held. She learned every lesson this way, not from books, not from teachers, from the rock itself, which taught by almost killing her, and then letting her figure out what she had done wrong. The second lesson came in the 5th month. She had pushed the tunnel deep enough that the air grew thin, not all at once, but gradually the way a river slows before it reaches a dam. Each day, the breathing at the far end became a little harder. Each day the lantern flame burned a little lower. Each day her head arced a little more after a long stretch of work. She ignored it the way she had learned to ignore most discomfort, by telling herself it would pass by pushing through, by refusing to acknowledge that the human body has limits, that willpower cannot override. She passed out at the tunnel face on a Tuesday afternoon. She came to an absolute darkness, the lantern dead, the air thick and stale, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. Minutes, maybe hours possibly. She could not tell. In total darkness, time loses its shape. A minute becomes an hour becomes a lifetime. She crawled out by touch. Both hands on the left wall moving forward by inches, counting the timber supports as she passed them because she knew how many there were between the face and the entrance. 22 supports. She counted each one with her fingertips. And when she reached number 22 and felt the breath of open air on her face, she crawled into the starlight and lay on her back and breathed and breathed and breathed. The next morning, she began solving the problem. She studied the way prairie dog burrows worked, the way the animals dug angled shafts that let fresh air circulate down to the deepest chambers. She drove a narrow borehole at an angle from the surf surface down to the tunnel, using a long iron rod she had found in the ruins of an abandoned homestead. She lined the hole with sections of hollow reed, creating a crude ventilation shaft. It was ugly. It was imperfect. It whistled in the wind like a broken flute, but it worked. The air at the tunnel face went from suffocating to merely thin, and the lantern burned steady again, and she did not pass out again. The 8th month brought the worst failure. Not dangerous this time, just devastating. She had been digging at a slight upward angle without realizing it, so gradual that her level of bottle of water she checked against the tunnel floor had not caught the drift. Grandfather Wren would later tell her that this was the most common mistake, that the body naturally wants to dig upward, because upward feels like progress, feels like climbing towards something, while digging downward feels like burial. But she did not have Grandfather Wren yet. She had no one. She discovered the error when she poured a bucket of water on the tunnel floor to clear the dust and watched it flow the wrong direction toward the face instead of toward the entrance. If she found water at this angle, it would pull inside the tunnel instead of draining out. She would have to pump it by hand, bucket by bucket, forever, or she would have to go back to the point where the angle went wrong and start again. She went back. 3 weeks of work destroyed. She sat at the junction point where the tunnel began to climb, and she put her head in her hands, and she wept. Not the quiet tears she had shed at her parents' graves. These were the hot, furious tears of someone who was angry at themselves, at the rock, at the impossible task they have chosen, at the universe, for not making things easier for people who are already carrying more than they should. She cried until she was empty. Then she picked up the pickaxe and started redigging the last 3 weeks of her life at the correct angle, checking the water level every 10 feet, refusing to trust her body's instincts over the evidence of the water in the bottle. By the end of the first year, the tunnel was 100 feet deep. Her hands were callous, so thick the skin had turned a different color, yellowish and hard like the horn of an animal. She could grip the pickaxe handle for 16 hours without blistering. She could carry rubble in her arms without feeling the sharp edges cut her skin. Her body had adapted to the tunnel the way a river adapts to its bed, reshaping itself around the obstacle, becoming something it had not been before. That was when Jesse Waller showed up. He appeared at the tunnel mouth on a Saturday evening, a tall young man of about 20, with dust on his boots and a look on his face that was equal parts curiosity and anger. Not anger at May, anger at the world that had brought him here, the world where his family had worked Virginia Thorne's land for 10 years and owed more now than they did when they started, where the water debt grew faster than the crops, where every harvest went to pay for the water that made the next harvest possible, a cycle that had no exit and no end. "I heard about what you're doing," he said. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the tunnel, the way a man looks at a locked door for which he does not have the key, but suspects someone else might. "I heard you're digging for water." "I am." "You really believe it's in there?" "My grandmother said it was." Jesse looked at the tunnel for a long time. Then he looked back at May, at her calloused hands and her dust-covered face and her shoulders that had grown broader than any 15-year-old girl's shoulders had a right to be. "If you find water," he said, "my family is free. Everyone's free." He started coming in the evenings after his day's work on Thorne's ranch was done. He was stronger than May, his arms thicker, his swings more powerful, and together they moved rock at twice the speed she had managed alone. Snorts. But strength was not his most important contribution. On his third visit, he picked up May's pickaxe and ran his thumb along the blade and shook his head the way a man shakes his head when he sees something so wrong it almost circles back to funny. "When did you last sharpen this?" May stared at him. It had not occurred to her that a pickaxe needed sharpening. She had been swinging a dull blade for 8 months, doubling the effort of every stroke, wearing herself down against rock that a sharp edge would have cut in half the time. Clear's throat. Jesse brought a wet stone the next day. He sat outside the tunnel in the fading light and showed her how to draw the blade across the stone at the right angle, how to feel for the burr that told you the edge was forming, how to test the sharpness with your thumb pressed lightly, not across the blade, but along it. "My daddy taught me this," he said. "Only smart thing he ever did." The next morning, May swung the sharpened pickaxe, and the difference was so dramatic, she almost laughed. The rock that had resisted her for months split clean under the new edge. 8 months of dull labor, 8 months of unnecessary exhaustion, all because no one had taught her a skill that any man in the valley would have known from boyhood. She thought about that often in the years that followed. How much of what holds people back is not lack of strength or lack of will, but simply lack of knowledge. A piece of information so basic that no one thinks to share it. A wet stone and 10 minutes of instruction and the impossible becomes merely difficult. Jesse brought more than knowledge. He brought presence. For the first time in a year, May was not alone in the darkness. They worked side by side, taking turns at the face, one swinging while the other hauled rubble. And in the breaks between shifts, they sat outside, and Jesse told stories about his family's ranch, about the horses he had trained, about the places he wanted to see if he ever got free of Virginia Thorne's ledger. He made May laugh, which was something she had not done since before her parents died, and the sound of her own laughter startled her, as if she had forgotten her voice could do that. But the tunnel was not the only place where information traveled through darkness. Virginia Thorne learned about Jesse Waller in the same way she learned about everything in the Saguarro Valley. Someone told her, and the someone was Nettie Groves. Nettie did not mean it to betray anyone. She was sitting in Virginia Thorne's parlor, the monthly visit she made to settle her water account, the ritual humiliation she endured to keep access to the well. Thorne had asked casually how the Colton girl was getting along. Just conversation. Just a woman asking after her neighbor. And Nettie, anxious, wanting to fill the silence, wanting to show that she was cooperative, that she was no threat, that she deserved continued access to the water she needed to survive, had mentioned that someone was helping May dig. A young man, one of the ranch hands. She realized her mistake the moment the words left her mouth. She saw it in the way Thorne's eyes changed, the way the casual interest hardened into something calculating, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Nettie went home sick with shame. She did not sleep that night. Snorts. She lay in her bed and listened to the desert wind and understood that she had done something she could not undo. 3 days later, Virginia Thorne called the Waller family to her ranch house. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Thorne did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She simply explained in the same tone she used to discuss the weather that if Jesse continued to assist the Colton girl, the Waller family's tenancy would be terminated, their water access revoked, and their outstanding debts called in immediately. All of them at once. Jesse's father was a man who had been broken slowly over 10 years. The way water breaks stone, not in a single blow, but in the steady accumulation of pressure applied to the same point over and over until the structure fails. He went home and told his son to stop. Jesse came to the tunnel that evening for the last time. He stood at the entrance and he did not go in. May came out and saw his face and knew before he spoke. "I can't come back," he said. "She got to my family. My father says if I come here again, we lose everything." May nodded. She wanted to say that she understood. She wanted to say that it was not his fault that Thorne had been playing this game longer than either of them had been alive, that the system was designed to isolate anyone who dared to help someone Thorne wanted to destroy. She wanted to say all of that, but the words would not come because her throat was closed with a grief she had not expected to feel. Instead, she said, "Thank you for the whetstone." Jesse reached behind the boulder where he kept his tools and pulled out his pickaxe. The one with the blade he kept sharp, the handle he had wrapped in leather for a better grip. He set it against the tunnel wall. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need a good blade where you're going." Then he walked away down the hillside, and May stood alone at the mouth of the tunnel, holding a pickaxe that was not hers, and listening to his footsteps fade until the only sound left was the wind moving through the rocks. Nettie Groves came the next week, but she did not bring food. She stood outside the tunnel with her arms wrapped around herself, despite the heat, and she could not meet May's eyes. I can't come here anymore. She said she knows I've been helping you. She told Caraway to review my water account." Ned's voice broke on the word water, the way a voice breaks on the name of something you cannot live without. "If I lose access to that well, I die. I'm 60 years old. I can't walk to the next town." May watched the woman who had been her mother's friend, the woman who had brought her cornbread and stories and warmth when the world offered none of those things. She watched fear remake Nettie's face into something she barely recognized. Then Nettie said the words that cut deepest. "Maybe your mama was wrong, honey," Blair's throat. "Maybe there's no water in that rock. Maybe you should take Thorne's offer before there's nothing left to sell." May said nothing. There was nothing to say. Nettie was not being cruel. Nettie was being 60 years old and alone and terrified of dying of thirst in a valley where one woman owned all the water. Nettie walked away. She did not look back. That night, May sat at the tunnel entrance and stared into the darkness she had carved and asked herself the question she had been refusing to ask for over a year. What if they are all right? What if there is no water? What if her grandmother was wrong, and her mother died believing a lie, and she was digging her own grave, one pickaxe stroke at a time? She sat with that question for a long time. She let it fill her completely. The doubt, the exhaustion, the loneliness so total, it felt like a physical weight on her chest. She was 16 years old. She had no family. She had no friends. She had a hole in a rock and a cold stone in her pocket. And 87 days before Caraway took her land. The second summer brought heat that felt personal, as if the sun had chosen this valley specifically to punish. And it brought Grandfather Wren. She found him on a morning when the air was so still the dust hung suspended, refusing to settle. She came out of the tunnel blinking, adjusting to the light, and he was simply there. An old man, sitting on a flat rock near the entrance, with his eyes closed and his right ear pressed against the ground. 93 years old. A Tohono O'odham elder, whose family had walked this desert since before the Spanish brought their horses, and their god, and their talent for claiming things that did not belong to them. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain why he was there. He finished listening to whatever the earth was telling him, then opened his eyes and looked at May with an expression that contained no pity, no judgment, and no surprise, as if he had known he would find her here, as if the desert had told him exactly where she would be. "You're close," he said. "The water speaks. Can you hear it?" May listened. She heard the wind. She heard her own breathing. She heard nothing else. "You will learn," Grandfather Wren said. "The water has been waiting a long time. It will wait a little longer." He came back every few weeks after that, arriving without announcement and departing without goodbye, appearing at the tunnel the way weather appears on the horizon, inevitable and on its own schedule. He brought food when May was too exhausted to find her own. He brought water when her supplies ran low, and he brought knowledge that could not be found in any book, because it had been passed from hand to hand for 1,000 years, refined by generations of people who had learned to survive in a landscape that did not forgive mistakes. He taught her to listen to the rock, not as a metaphor, as a skill. He showed her how to tap the tunnel wall with the flat of the pickaxe and listen to the resonance. A short, dead echo meant solid stone all the way through. A longer humming echo meant hollow space somewhere behind the wall. He blindfolded her with a strip of cloth and made her practice tap and listen for hours at a time, until her ears could distinguish between the two sounds as clearly as a musician distinguishes between two notes on a piano. He taught her to read the fractures in the rock. Dry cracks, he explained, were made by heat, the stone expanding and contracting with the seasons. But wet cracks were different. They were the scars left by water that had once flowed through the stone, possibly thousands of years ago, channels that had dried up on the surface, but might still connect to something deeper. "Follow the wet cracks," he told her. "Water remembers its old paths." And he taught her patience, though not in the way she expected. One afternoon, she came out of the tunnel to rest and found him sitting perfectly still, watching a harvester ant carry a piece of mesquite seed across the flat rock. The seed was many times the ant size, and the root across the rock was not smooth. The ant reached a crack, lost its grip, dropped the seed, climbed down to retrieve it, climbed back up, dropped it again, climbed down again, over and over. Grandfather Wren watched this for the better part of an hour, his ancient face as patient as the stone itself. "What are you watching?" May asked. "I am watching you," he said. She looked at the ant. The ant that kept dropping its load and climbing back down to retrieve it and climbing back up and trying again. She understood. She did not need the lesson explained. She sat down next to Grandfather Wren, and they watched the ant together until it finally made it across the crack and disappeared into the dirt on the other side, still carrying its seed. "Why are you helping me?" she asked him once, weeks later in the tunnel, where they had been working side by side in near silence, May swinging and Renex examining the rock face with his fingertips. "Because the water wants to be found," he said, "and you are the one who will find it." Virginia Thorne came to the Mesa in the middle of the second year. She did not come alone, she snorts. Brought caraway and a dozen men from town ranchers and merchants, and the kind of people who follow power, because standing near it feels safer than standing alone. She did not speak to May. She did not look at her. She sat on her horse at the base of the hillside and addressed her entourage as if May were not there. As if the girl standing at the tunnel entrance with rock dust in her hair and Jessie's pickaxe in her hand were part of the landscape no more significant than the boulders or the dead palo verde tree. "You see what I mean?" she said to the men around her. "The girl is out of her mind. Her mother was the same way, stubborn until it killed her." She turned to Caraway, who sat his horse with his ledger, balanced on the saddle horn. "How much time does she have left on the debt?" "A few months," Caraway said. "We've extended twice already." "Don't extend again." The men murmured their agreement. They looked at the tunnel, at the pile of rubble outside it, at the girl, and they saw what Virginia Thorne wanted them to see. Foolishness. Waste. A child playing at something that adults knew was impossible. They rode away. Thorne never once turned her head in May's direction. The contempt of being ignored was sharper than any insult she could have spoken. But Caraway lingered. He dismounted and walked to the tunnel entrance and stood there looking into the darkness for a long time. Then he turned to May and spoke in a voice so low that no one but her could hear. "Your grandmother came to the bank once, 30 years ago, asked for a loan to dig into this mesa. I was just a clerk then." He paused. We turned her down. He put his hat back on and walked to his horse and rode after the others without another word. May stood at the tunnel entrance, holding that piece of information the way she held the cold stone, turning it over, feeling its weight. Her grandmother had tried, not just believed, not just told stories, but actually walked into a bank and asked for money to dig. She had been turned away, and she had never told anyone, and she had died carrying the disappointment of a dream deferred, but never abandoned, the stone in May's pocket pressed against her thigh, cold as always. 6 weeks later, on a night when the moon was dark and the stars gave barely enough light to see the road, May set down her pickaxe, walked out of the tunnel, and kept walking. She did not plan it. Her feet simply carried her away from the mesa and toward town, and she let them. And after an hour of walking, she found herself standing outside the gate of Virginia Thorne's ranch. The house was lit from within, yellow lamplights spilling through the windows into the desert night. May could see the porch where Thorne stood each morning to watch the families come. She could see the path that led to the well. She could see the corral where the horses stood, and the barn where the ledger was kept, the book that held the debts of every family in the valley, including hers. She stood at the gate for a long time, long enough for the sweat to dry on her skin and the night air to raise goosebumps on her arms. She was so close. 10 steps to the porch, a knock on the door, 2 words, "I quit," and it would be over. The digging, the darkness, the loneliness, the doubt. She could sell the land, take whatever Thorne offered, walk away from the mesa and the tunnel and the cold stone and the dead woman's promise, and start over somewhere else. Somewhere with water that came from a faucet instead of from a dream. Her right hand was in her pocket. Her fingers were wrapped around the stone. It pressed against her palm the way it always did, cold and smooth and impossible. 3 generations of women had held the stone. Her grandmother had found it at the base of the mesa and kept it for 30 years. Her mother had carried it through 2 droughts and a fever, and a lifetime of being told she was a fool. Now May held it, and her hand was calloused and torn and strong in ways it had not been a year ago. And the stone was still cold. In the coldness meant something that no surveyor had ever measured, and no banker had ever written in a ledger. She turned around. She walked 3 miles back to the mesa in darkness. In the morning, she picked up Jessie's pickaxe, the one with the leather-wrapped handle, and she went back into the tunnel. Behind her, unseen, a lamp went out in the upstairs window of the Thorne ranch house. Someone had been watching. The 3rd year brought a change that May felt before she understood it. The rock was different now. Not softer exactly, but denser, tighter, as if it were compressing around something it was trying to protect. In the 2nd month of the 3rd year, she hit a layer of stone so hard that the pickaxe bounced back and nearly took out her teeth. For 2 weeks, she barely advanced a foot. The blade of Jessie's pickaxe, the blade she had kept sharp the way he taught her, began to chip. She sat outside the tunnel on the 14th night and looked at the damaged blade and felt something close to despair. Not the hot, crying kind, the quiet kind, the kind that whispers instead of shouts, that tells you in a reasonable voice that you have done your best, and your best was not enough, and there is no shame in admitting it. Then she looked at the desert around her, at the cracked earth, at a saguarro cactus whose roots had split a boulder in half, not with force, but with slow, relentless expansion, growing into every tiny fissure over decades, until the stone had no choice but to give way. She went back into the tunnel the next morning with a different approach. She drilled small holes into the hard layer using the iron rod, then cut wedges from dry mesquite wood and hammered them into the holes. Then she poured water over the wedges. The wood swelled. The stone cracked. It was slow. So slow that some days she gained only inches. But it worked. The desert had taught her how to break stone without force. Patience and water, and wood the oldest tools in the world. Beyond the tunnel, the valley was emptying. The drought had stretched into its second year and showed no sign of breaking. Thorne's well produced less each month. The price of water climbed past anything a working family could afford. Snorts. Wagons left weekly headed west to California or east to Texas, carrying everything a family owned, and the particular silence of people who have given up. May walked past the Briggs homestead one evening and found it abandoned. The door hung open. Wind moved through empty rooms. The man who had told her she was following her father into the ground had left without saying goodbye to anyone. Snorts. His land would go to Thorne. Everything went to Thorne. Holt Carrowaway came one final time at the beginning of the 3rd year's last month. He dismounted at the tunnel entrance and stood with his leather folder and his vest in his banker's patience. The 90-day deadline had been extended twice May, scraping together small payments by selling her remaining goats, by doing occasional labor for ranchers who still had work to offer. But the extensions were over. 30 days, he said. Mrs. Thorne wants the land. I've done what I can. 30 days, May repeated. She looked at the tunnel entrance, at the 290 feet of darkness behind her, at the rock that had been getting different for weeks now, the resonance changing when she tapped the air, growing cooler at the face, even though she was deeper than ever. I only need one more. Carroway shook his head and rode away, certain he was dealing with madness. That night, alone in the tunnel at 300 feet, May tapped the wall with the flat of the pickaxe the way Grandfather Wren had taught her. She pressed her ear to the stone. She listened, and for the first time, she heard it. Not water exactly. Not yet. But the echo that came back from her tap was different from any echo she had heard in 3 years of digging. Longer, deeper, resonant in a way that made the stone itself seem to hum. Behind this wall, something was hollow. Behind this wall, something was waiting. She pressed her palm flat against the rock. It was cold, colder than the surrounding stone, colder than anything at this depth had any reason to be. She pulled the stone from her pocket and held it against the wall. The same temperature. Exactly the same, 20 feet, maybe less. The water her grandmother had promised the river, that everyone said did not exist, was 20 feet away, separated from her by a wall of stone that she would break with a dead man's pickaxe, and 3 years of patience in the unshakable belief of 3 women who had refused to stop believing in something they could feel but could not see. May set down the pickaxe. She pressed both hands against the cold wall. She closed her eyes, and she listened. She struck the wall 23 times before it broke. She had been counting without meaning to. The way a person counts, steps on a staircase, they have climbed 1,000 times. The body keeping track of what the mind has stopped paying attention to. 23 swings of Jessie's pickaxe over the course of 4 hours, each one aimed at the same spot. A hairline fracture she had found by running her fingertips across the rock face in the dark after her lantern oil ran out. And Clear's throat. She decided to keep working anyway. The first 20 swings deepened the crack by fractions. The 21st opened it wide enough to fit a knife blade. The 22nd sent a chip of stone flying past her ear, and she heard something behind the wall that made her freeze. A whisper, not wind, not settling rock, something liquid, something moving, something alive, in a way that stone is not. The 23rd swing broke through. The pickaxe punched through the wall and kept going. The sudden lack of resistance pulling May forward, so that she stumbled against the rock face. She felt cold air rush past her wrist through the opening, and then the water came. It did not trickle. It did not seep. It poured through the crack in a pressurized stream that hit her square in the chest and knocked her backward. She landed hard on the tunnel floor, the pickaxe clattering away, and the water surged over her, around her, past her. It pulled at her feet, rose to her ankles, climbed to her shins. She scrambled backward on her hands, suddenly terrified that she had opened something she could not close. That 3 years of digging had led her to her own drowning. That the last thing she would ever feel would be the water she had spent 1,000 days searching for, filling her lungs and taking her the way the fever had taken her mother. But the tunnel held. The timber supports she had placed with such care, the ones she had taught herself to build after the first collapse nearly killed her, held the ceiling firm. And the water, after its initial surge, began to slow. It found the channel she had dug the gradual downward slope she had maintained so carefully after the mistake in the first year that cost her 3 weeks of work. It followed the path she had made for it, flowing toward the entrance the way she had always intended, obeying the angle she had corrected and recorrected and checked with a water bottle every 10 feet for 2.5 years. Within an hour, the flood had become a stream 6 in wide, steady, confident, pouring out of the Me's face and down the hillside with the easy authority of something that has always known where it was going and has simply been waiting for someone to open the door. May followed the water out. She walked behind it through 320 feet of tunnel, through 3 years of her own history, past the timber supports and the ventilation shafts and the junction where she had redigged the wrong angle and the place where the ceiling had collapsed and nearly buried her, and the spot where Jesse had set down his pickaxe for the last time. She walked through all of it, and the water walked with her. And when she reached the entrance and stepped into the light, the desert sun hit her face and the water poured past her feet, and she stood there and could not move. The stream ran down the hillside, cutting a dark line through the pale dust, finding its way between rocks and around boulders, heading toward the natural depression below the mesa, where it would gather and pull and become something the valley had not seen in 2 years. A pond, a source, a beginning. May did not cry right away. She stood at the tunnel entrance with the water flowing around her boots, and she breathed in and out. The air smelled different now. It smelled like wet stone and cold earth, and something she could not name. Something ancient and clean that had been locked inside the mesa since before anyone had lived in this valley. She reached into her pocket and took out the stone, the small smooth stone that her grandmother had found, and her mother had carried, and she had held in her fist on every night when the doubt was louder than the digging. She knelt beside the stream and placed the stone in the water, pressing it into the sandy bed until it settled. It looked like it belonged there. It looked like it had always belonged there. Then she cried. She did not tell anyone for 7 days. She spent that week alone with the water, watching it, testing it, making sure it was real. She built a rough basin from stones and clay to catch the overflow. She dug shallow channels to direct the stream toward the depression. She drank from it, cupping her hands under the flow and bringing the water to her lips. It tasted the way cold tastes when you have been hot for a very long time, sharp and clean, and so immediate that it made her teeth ache. On the 3rd day, she heard footsteps on the hillside above her. She looked up and saw a figure standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky. Samuel Fenn. He was carrying a water barrel on his back, strapped with rope, on his way to Thorne's well by the long road that skirted the mesa's north face. He had stopped because he heard something impossible. Running water in the desert in the middle of a drought that had driven half the valley's families away. He looked down the hillside and saw the stream cutting through the dust. He saw May standing beside it, thin and covered in rock dust, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had been reshaped by 3 years of labor. And she was smiling. Not the careful, calculating smile of Virginia Thorne. A different kind of smile. The kind that comes from the inside and does not need an audience. Samuel stood on the ridge for a long time. He did not shout. He did not run down the hill. He watched and he understood. And he made a decision that May would not learn about until later. He shifted the water barrel on his back and continued walking toward Thorne's well. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. He gave May her week of silence because he understood without being told that she needed to be sure. That after 3 years of doubt, she needed time alone with the proof. It was the kind of understanding that does not require words, the kind that one person extends to another when they have been paying attention quietly without asking for credit for a very long time. On the 8th morning, May filled 2 buckets from the stream and walked into town. The valley was in its worst crisis. Thorne's well had dropped to a trickle, barely enough to supply her own household and the families who could still afford her prices, which by now was almost nobody. The storefronts on the main street were half-shuttered. The schoolhouse had closed because there were not enough children left to fill a single row of desks. The cemetery on the hill behind the church had gained more residents in the past year than the town itself. People moved through the plaza with the slow, heavy gait of those who are conserving energy because they do, clears throat, not know when they will eat or drink next. They looked at the ground. They did not look at each other because looking at each other meant acknowledging that they were all thinking the same thing, that it was time to leave, that the valley was finished, that Virginia Thorne's well was dying. And when it died, everything died with it. May walked into the middle of the plaza and set the 2 buckets down on the packed earth. Water sloshed gently over the rims, catching the sunlight, throwing small bright patterns on the dust. The sound of water drew them the way a match draws moths. One person looked, then another. Then a crowd formed slowly at first. Then, all at once, people drifting toward the center of the plaza from doorways and porches, and the shadows they had been sitting in their eyes, fixed on the buckets with an intensity that bordered on reverence. A woman knelt and dipped her hand in. She brought her wet fingers to her lips and tasted, and her face changed. Not just surprise, something deeper. Relief so profound it looked like pain. "Where did you get this?" a man asked. "From my tunnel," May said. "The one everyone laughed at. The one that led to nowhere." The plaza went quiet. Not the quiet of disbelief. The quiet that comes before a shift so large that the people who witness it can feel the ground moving beneath them, even though nothing visible has changed. "There's more," May said. "Enough for everyone. Enough for the whole valley. My grandmother was right. There's a river under the mesa, and I found it." In the silence that followed, one person moved. Samuel Fenn stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He did not ask a question. He did not wait for an invitation. He walked to where May stood, picked up one of the buckets, and held it steady while an old woman filled her jar. Then he carried the second bucket to a family with 3 children who were too shy to push through the crowd. May watched him, and something clicked into place, the way a stone clicks into a wall when it finds the spot. It was shaped for the coil of rope outside her tunnel 3 years ago, the one left by a stranger she could not identify. She looked at Samuel's hands, the way he gripped the bucket handle, the way he moved through the crowd without drawing attention to himself, the way he helped without being asked. It was him. She was certain of it now. 3 years ago, on the day the men came to tell her to stop digging, one of them had stayed behind and left a coil of rope. Not a word, Mame. Not a name. Just the thing she needed placed where she would find it given and without expectation. Their eyes met across the plaza, and Samuel nodded once the smallest gesture in the world, an acknowledgement that needed no translation. In the crowd, 2 other faces caught May's attention. Nettie Grove stood at the edge of the plaza behind everyone else, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes red. She did not come forward. She did not speak. She stood where she was and watched the water being passed from hand to hand, and tears ran down her cheeks in 2 straight lines. And Jesse Waller stood near the general store with his father, both of them staring at the buckets as if the laws of nature had just been rewritten in front of them. Jesse's mouth was open. His father's mouth was closed, but his hands were shaking. Virginia Thorne arrived within the hour. She came on horseback, flanked by Puits and 2 ranch hands, riding fast enough to raise a column of dust that could be seen from 3 streets away. She pulled her horse up at the edge of the plaza and dismounted with the rigid grace of a woman who has controlled everything in her life and has just discovered something beyond her control. Her face was white, not pale. White. The color of paper, the color of bone, the color of something that has had the blood drain from it. "This is impossible," she said. "There's no water in that Mesa." Every surveyor was wrong. May's voice was steady, but it was not loud. She did not need it to be loud. The water in the buckets was louder than anything she could say. "You told me to dig until my hands bled. I did. You told me I was wasting my life. I wasn't. You laughed at me for 3 years while I carved through solid rock." She gestured at the crowd, at the faces turned toward her, at the children who were touching the surface of the water in the buckets with their fingertips as if it might not be real. "This is what I found, and I'm giving it away free to everyone who needs it." The plaza erupted, not with cheers, with movement. People went home for containers. They came back with buckets and barrels and clay pots and tin cups and anything that could hold water. Word spread outward from the plaza in concentric circles, reaching the outlying farms within hours, reaching the families who had been packing their wagons and preparing to leave by nightfall. They came to May's tunnel in a procession that lasted 3 days. Families in wagons, old men on mules, children walking barefoot alongside their mothers. They came from every corner of the valley, from homesteads that had been dying for 2 years, from farms where the last crop had withered, in the field from houses where the water barrel had been empty so long the wood had cracked and warped. The stream poured from the hillside, and they filled their containers, and they wept the way people weep when something they had given up on turns out to be real after all. Children who had never seen running water splashed in the overflow, shrieking at the cold, not understanding why their parents were crying while they played. Old men knelt by the stream and closed their eyes and pressed their palms flat on the wet earth, and gave thanks to whatever power had put water inside stone and stubbornness inside a 15-year-old girl. Women filled jar after jar, loading them into wagons, carrying them back to gardens that had been dead for 2 years, pouring water onto cracked soil, and watching it darken and soften, and remember what it was supposed to do. Grandfather Wren came on the 2nd day. He was 96 years old. His legs could no longer carry him the distance from his home to the Mesa. So he asked 2 young men from the PBLO to carry him in a chair made of canvas and pine poles. They sat him down at the tunnel entrance, and he sat there in his chair with his eyes closed and listened. He had been listening to water his whole life, through stone, through sand, through the soles of his feet pressed against the earth. He had taught himself, and then he had taught others, passing the knowledge down the way his grandfather had passed it to him. But he had never heard anything like this. Water flowing free after ages of imprisonment, singing through the tunnel May had carved, filling the desert air with a sound that was older than language. The water was waiting, he said. His voice was thin but steady, for someone with enough patience, for someone who would listen. I knew it was you, child, from the first day I met you. The water knew too. It called to you through the stone, and you answered. I couldn't have done it without you, May said. She was kneeling beside his chair, holding his hand, which was light and papery and warm. You kept me going when I wanted to give up. You corrected my course when I was digging wrong. Snorts. You believed in me when no one else did. I didn't give you patience. I didn't give you faith. Those were yours from the beginning. I just reminded you what you already knew. He smiled, and the wrinkles in his face rearranged themselves into something that looked for just a moment like the face of a much younger man. Your grandmother would be proud. Your mother would be proud. You have done what our people have been doing for 1,000 years. You listened to the earth, and the earth provided. On the third day, Nettie Groves came to the tunnel. She did not approach May. She stood 30 feet from the stream, arms wrapped around herself, the way she had stood on the day she came to say goodbye. And she watched the water flow, and she did not move. May saw her from the tunnel entrance. She saw the woman who had brought her cornbread and stories in the first week, who had told her about her mother's courage, who had warned her to be careful. The woman who had then betrayed Jessie's secret out of fear, and told May her mother might have been wrong, and walked away when walking away was the safer choice. May felt the anger first. It came up hot and sharp, the memory of Nettie's words in the second year, the memory of standing alone at the tunnel entrance after Nettie left, the memory of the question that had followed. What if they are all right? Nettie had planted that question. Nettie had watered the doubt, but then May looked more carefully. Nettie was thinner than she had been 2 years ago. Her hands trembled. Her cheeks had gone hollow. She had been rationing the water for months, buying less and less from Thorne as her savings dwindled, drinking just enough to survive and not a drop more. She was 62 years old, and she was dying slowly, and she had come to the tunnel, not to ask for forgiveness, but simply to see with her own eyes whether the thing she had told May to stop believing in was real. May, Claire's throat, walked to her. She did not speak. She filled a clay jar from the stream and held it out. Nettie looked at the jar, then looked at May, and her face collapsed the way a wall collapses when the last supporting beam is removed. Not with violence, with surrender. Your mama wasn't wrong, Nettie said. I was. May nodded. She put the jar in Nettie's hands and closed her fingers around it. Nettie held the water against her chest and closed her eyes and stood there for a long time, not drinking, just holding as if the weight of it was something she needed to feel before she could believe it. Then she drank. There are some debts that water can wash clean. Not all of them, but some. Virginia Thorne came to the tunnel on the 4th day. She came alone this time. No entourage. No Puits with his ledger. No men from town to laugh on cue. Just Virginia Thorne on her best horse, wearing her finest dress, her fingers heavy with turquoise rings purchased with 20 years of other people's desperation. She dismounted and walked to the tunnel entrance and stood before the stream that poured from the hillside. And she watched it for a long time without speaking. Behind her, Families continued to fill their containers, but they gave her a wide berth, the way people give a wide berth to something they used to fear, and have not yet stopped fearing, even though the reason for the fear is gone. "How did Clear's throat, you know?" she asked finally. Her voice was different now, stripped of its honey, stripped of its control, just a voice asking a question. "How did you know there was water here when every surveyor, every expert, every educated man said there was nothing?" "My grandmother told my mother," May said, "and my mother told me the water was always there. Someone just had to be patient enough to find it. I could have helped you. I could have paid for workers, for equipment, for engineers. You would have taken the water for yourself the way you took everything from everyone in this valley." The words hung in the air between them. Thorne did not flinch. She was too practiced for flinching. "I watched you for 3 years, Mrs. Thorne. I watched you charge dying people for water they needed to survive. I watched you take their land, their cattle, their dignity. I watched you smile when the drought got worse, because it meant you could charge more. That's business. That's how the world works. Maybe. But this tunnel isn't business. This tunnel is a gift. My grandmother found this water 60 years ago and couldn't reach it. My mother believed in it and died before she could see it. I dug for 3 years to set it free, and now it belongs to everyone. I don't want your help. I don't want anything from you. I just want people to have water without giving up everything they own." Thorne looked at May for a long time. She looked at the stream. She looked at the families filling their containers, at the children playing in the overflow, at the old men kneeling by the water. "You've ruined me," she said. The words were quiet, almost private spoken, not with anger, but with the flat recognition of someone seeing clearly for the first time. "My well will never recover. My power is gone. Your power was built on other people's suffering. That's not power. That's just cruelty dressed up in fine clothes." May pointed to the tunnel behind her. "This is power. The earth provides for those who know how to ask. You never learn to ask. You only learn to take." Then came the moment that nobody in the valley expected. Whole Caraway had been standing 10 paces behind Virginia Thorne throughout the entire conversation. Silent, watching, his leather folder tucked under his arm, the way it always was. The folder that contained the debts and deeds and mortgages of every family in the Saguarro Valley. The folder that was Virginia Thorne's real weapon, the instrument that turned thirst into ownership. Caraway stepped forward. He walked past Thorne without looking at her. He stopped at a flat rock beside the stream, opened the leather folder, and removed a single document. The Colton mortgage, May's debt, the 90-day clock that had been ticking since the week she buried her mother. He set the document on the rock. He looked at Virginia Thorne. Then he looked at May. "Consider the debt settled," he said. "The land is yours, free and clear." Thorne turned to him with an expression that May had never seen on her face before. Shock. Genuine, unfiltered shock. The look of a woman who has just watched her own foundation crack. "Tom," she said, one word. His name. A warning, a question, and a plea compressed into a single syllable. Caraway did not respond. He closed the leather folder, tucked it back under his arm, and walked to his horse. He was not a good man. He had never been a good man. He was the same practical, precise instrument he had always been. But practical men know how to read a situation, and this situation was as clear as the water pouring from the hillside. The power in this valley had shifted. The water had moved, and Hulk Caraway, who had spent his career standing next to whoever held the power, simply moved with it, Virginia Thorne mounted her horse. She looked at the tunnel one last time at the water at May, at the families at the desert that had made her rich, and was now taking it all back. She rode away without another word. Within a year, she had sold the ranch and left for California, taking what remained of her fortune and nothing of her legacy. Her well never produced again. The aquifer that had fed it was connected to the same underground river that May had opened. And once the water found an easier path through the tunnel, it abandoned the narrow fissure that had fed Thorne's well for decades. The well went dry, the ranch crumbled, the land returned to the desert, and the desert accepted it back the way it accepts everything, without ceremony, without memory, without care. Nobody mourned. Nobody sent letters. Nobody spoke her name with anything but the fading irritation of people remembering a storm that has passed. She had built an empire on fear, and fear does not outlive the thing that feeds it. The valley recovered. It happened slowly, the way all real healing happens. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small changes that add up over months and years. Until one day you look around and realize that the world is different from the one you were living in before. Farms came back to life. Fields that had been brown and cracked turned green. Families that had been packing their wagons unpacked them. The schoolhouse reopened. The general store restocked its shelves. The cemetery stopped growing. The stream from May's tunnel never stopped flowing. Not in the dry months. Not in the hottest summers. Not in the years when the rain failed again. Because the river beneath the mesa did not depend on rain. It drew from something deeper, something older, a reservoir of water that had been accumulating in the darkness for longer than anyone could measure. Grandfather Wren died that winter. He passed in his sleep quietly, the way the desert goes quiet, just before dawn. They buried him on the hillside above the tunnel, in a spot where the sound of running water reached even in the stillness of early morning. His headstone was a flat piece of sandstone, cut from the mesa itself, and it read, "He taught her to listen." May visited his grave every morning for the rest of her life. She would stand there as the sun came up the stream flowing below her, the mesa rising above, and she would close her eyes and listen the way he had taught her. Sometimes she heard the water, sometimes she heard the wind, sometimes she heard nothing at all. And that was fine, because Grandfather Wren had taught her that silence has its own kind of voice. And the people who can hear it are the ones who have learned to be still. Jesse Waller left his family's tenancy on Thorne's land the week after the water was found. He claimed a 40-acre parcel of open land west of the Mesa land that nobody had wanted before, because there was no water, and he dug an irrigation channel from Mayreem to his new fields. He planted corn the first year, and it grew. He built a house the second year, and it stood. He became the kind of quiet, competent man who shows up when there is work to be done and leaves when the work is finished and never talks about either. He never came back to the tunnel, whatever the tunnel meant to him, whatever memories it held of those evening shifts working beside a girl who was too stubborn to quit. He kept those to himself. But every autumn after the harvest, a basket of corn appeared on May's doorstep. No name, no note. Just corn freshly picked, the ears still warm from the field. May never mentioned it. She did not need to. Some gratitude is expressed in bushels, not words. Nettie Groves lived another 10 years. She tended her garden, which flourished now that water was free, and she spent her mornings at the stream, the way other women spent their mornings at church, standing at the water's edge with her jar, filling it slowly, watching the current staying a few minutes longer than she needed to. Nobody asked her what she thought about during those minutes. Some things are between a woman and the water. She was buried in this town cemetery when she passed next to her husband, but May planted a mosque tree at the head of her grave. It grew tall and wide, and gave shade to a whole row of headstones. And in the spring, it dropped yellow flowers that covered the ground like small suns. It was the kind of memorial that Nettie would have chosen for herself. Not grand, not permanent, just living for as long as it could. May clears throat. Colton married Samuel Finn in the spring of the year after the water was found. The wedding was small, held at the tunnel entrance because May could not think of a place that meant more to her. And the sound of running water accompanied the vows the way music accompanies a hymn. Samuel was the man who had left the rope, the man who had stood on the ridge and kept her secret, the man who had picked up the bucket in the plaza before anyone else moved. He was not a man of speeches or grand gestures. He was a man who noticed things and acted on what he noticed without needing to be thanked or acknowledged or even seen. He had watched May for 3 years from a distance that was close enough to help and far enough to let her become what she needed to become on her own. They raised 6 children on the 40 acres that May's parents had left her. The rocky, worthless hillside that every surveyor had dismissed the land that Virginia Thorne had tried to take for the price of a shovel turned out to be the most valuable property in the territory. Not because of what was on it, but because of what was under it. A river that had been flowing in the dark since before anyone could remember, patient and cold and endless, waiting for someone to open a door. May lived until 1923. She was 60 years old when she died, surrounded by grandchildren who had never known thirst. They had grown up with water so abundant, they could not imagine a world without it. Could not imagine a time when water was something you beg for. Bargain for sold your land, and your livestock, and your future to obtain. They took the stream for granted the way all children take miracles for granted when they are born into the aftermath of someone else's sacrifice. They buried her on the hillside next to Grandfather Wren, above the tunnel that still flowed. Her headstone was cut from the same Meaor sandstone as his, and it read, "She dug toward water that nobody believed in. She found it." And on top of the headstone, placed there by her eldest daughter, on the day of the burial, sat a small stone, smooth, flat, about the size of a silver dollar. The stone that Ida Colton had found at the base of the mesa and carried for 30 years. The stone that May's mother had pressed into her daughter's palm on the night she died. The stone that May had placed in the stream on the day she found the water, and then retrieved the next morning because she could not let it go. Not yet. Not until her work was done. The stone still sits on the headstone. Visitors who come to the tunnel sometimes touch it. They always remark on the same thing. It is cold. Even in the middle of summer, even when the air shimmers with heat and the mesa bakes under the Arizona sun, the stone is cold. No one explains why. No one needs to. The people who understand already know. And the people who do not understand that are welcome to place their hand on the stone and feel it for themselves and draw their own conclusions. The tunnel is still there. 150 years have passed since a 15-year-old orphan girl picked up a pickaxe and walked into the darkness with nothing but a cold stone and a dead woman's promise. The mesa has not changed. The desert has not changed. The stream that pours from the hillside has not changed. It flows today the way it flowed on the day May broke through the wall, steady and clear. 6 inches wide, the same temperature. It has always been winter and summer, drought and rain. People come from miles around to fill their bottles. They stand where May stood, and they look into the tunnel, and they see 320 feet of darkness, and they try to imagine what it took. 3 years, 1,000 days. A girl with no training and no tools, and no help except an old man who taught her to listen, and a dead woman's stone that stayed cold when everything else burned. Some of them understand. The ones who have dug their own tunnels, who have spent years working towards something that no one else believed in, who have stood at the gate of surrender and turned around and walked back into the dark. They understand they do not need the story explained. Some stories end with confrontation. Some end with victory. This one ends with water, cold, clean, and endless flowing from darkness into light. Because one girl believed her grandmother and refused to stop digging when the whole world told her there was nothing there. The earth provides for those who learn to listen. And sometimes, if you dig deep enough, you find that what you were looking for was there all along, waiting beneath the stone patient, as the rock itself ready to rise the moment someone had the faith to reach.